Tonight's bedtime story is again from spooky Massachusetts, and it's for all the lovers. This story is set in Plymouth. Polly, ahoy Polly. The sound of my name ringing through the busy marketplace brought me to a halt. I whirled, heart racing with excitement as I recognized the beloved voice. It was Joe, my Joe, calling my name, which is a bit puzzling since he was supposed to be out on the banks with his captain father on a month-long fishing trip. Yet here he came, tripping through the crowd toward me with a basket of cod in his arm. I was thrilled to see him. A storm had come up a few nights before that had whipped the ocean into a sea of high waves, and I sat up most of the night, picturing Joe and his father fighting the waves in the Miranda Lee. She was a stout ship, but the storm was a killer. I ran forward and hugged Joe tight, smelly basket of fish notwithstanding. I was used to it by now. Some swains wooed their ladies with pretty words and flowers. My Joe didn't talk much, and came a-wooing with baskets of fish and crabs and other creatures from the sea. Not as pretty as flowers, but my parents and I had sat down a good many meals since Joe took a fancy to me. As I pulled back a little, I studied him. Blonde hair cut unfashionably short, the twinkling blue eye that seemed to see right into my soul. They laughed at me now as he stole a kiss right in the middle of the street. Rascal, I laughed, fending him off as a pretty pink color flooded my cheeks. What would mother say? Unrepentant, he ran a work-roughed hand through my black curls and caressed my cheek. What would mother say? He repeated mockingly, swinging the basket of fish to his other hip so he could pull me close. It's a good thing we are already betrothed, I said, severely, submitting to a second kiss. Oh, Father, would haul us before the preacher this instant. Joe laughed and hugged me so tight I could barely breathe. As for the flash of the moment, I sensed a deep pain inside him, an unbearable longing that I did not understand. It shook me to the core, and I held him tighter, trying to push myself inside him and take the pain away. Oh, Polly, Joe whispered against my hair. Remember how much I love you. Then he broke away, thrust the basket of fish in my arms, and vanished without a trace. I was astonished. One moment he was right in front of me, and the next he was gone, as if he had never been there. If it weren't for the smelly basket of fish in my arms, he might have just been a dream. Forgetting all about the errands that brought me to town, I headed back home with the fish, wishing that my arms would stop prickling. Shivers were running up and down my spine in dread of the wordless something I had sensed when Joe hugged me that last time. And why had he said those words? Remember how much I love you. Of course I would remember. We're getting married next month. My parents were surprised and pleased by the gift of cod that Joe had sent, but puzzled that he hadn't accompanied me home and stayed for dinner. Father decided that Joe must have been needed on the docks to help unload the ship. This sounds sensible to me until I remembered the strange way that he had vanished right before my eyes. The next morning brought a knock on the door from a neighbor. His face was sober, and he barely looked at Mother and me. He hurried Father into the study and shut the door. For a few moments there was just muffling sounds of low voices. Then Father emerged from our neighbor behind him. He came over to me, took my hand soberly, and I read the message on his face before he spoke. Joe is gone, Polly, he said sadly, his eyes brought with unshed tears. The Miranda Lee went down in the storm a few nights ago. She was capsized by a massive wave that wrecked nearly half the boats fishing the banks that night. Our neighbor nodded sadly. His ship was one of the few that had successfully ridden out the storm. He had seen the Miranda Lee go down with his own eyes, but had been too far away to help in any way. if he could have even helped in such a storm. The whole room started spinning, and the world turned gray before my eyes. Father and Mother helped me to a chair. By the time things came back to focus, our neighbor had tactfully taken himself away. My poor mind spun, trying to understand that Joe was gone, but it couldn't. My eyes widened, and I stared up at Father. Joe can't be dead, I cried. I saw him yesterday. He gave me the basket of cod. Mother gasped then and began to sob, and Father, glancing sadly at her, brushed his hand against my cheek, just as Joe had done yesterday, and said, "Polly, the basket of cod vanished as soon as your mother set it down on the kitchen table. The fish we ate last night came from the marketplace. We were too afraid to tell you, afraid of what it all might mean." It was then that I finally gasped what my parents were saying. It had been Joe's ghost who had visited me in the marketplace yesterday, come to say farewell. Remember how he held me so close, and the sensation of longing that I had sensed in him? I knew that he, wherever he was as saddened by our parting as I. "Remember how much I love you," Joe said. And I always would.